So first we're going to go over the philosophies of each time. So Aristotle's time was mostly influenced by Plato. So before there was Aristotle, the most influential philosopher was Plato, who was actually Aristotle's mentor. And Plato believed that the tangible world is filled with error and ugliness, but that there are ideals that are beyond that, which are intangible and which are eternal, like goodness, beauty, and equality. And he believed that these were timeless and these were, across every human, that these are ideals that cannot be tampered with. Similarly, the soul is independent from the body, so no matter what happens to your body, you still have the soul that stays intact. He also framed all of his philosophy, like his books and his writings, as dialogues between two people, usually debates or discussions about philosophical concepts. And then a little bit briefly about the laws of ancient Greece. There were no written laws until 620 BC, which is after Oedipus takes place. And Aristotle lived. So there were no written laws during the time of Oedipus and Aristotle. And basically it was just kind of believed that, like, if someone kills you, then your family members have the right to kill them. It all kind of worked like that, like eye for an eye. Sort of, it relied on each individual person to enact justice within themselves. So Aristotle, he developed logic. He developed the idea that you can have a structured, scientific, methodical approach to reason. And he also developed this idea of teleology, which is that everything is directed towards a purpose or location. So everything happens with an end goal in mind. He saw morality as a practical field. So again, like logical, you can put a scientific method to philosophy, morality, ethics, all of those practices. And he thought that humans were naturally political and free citizenship and self-governing is best. So he's more in line with what we would think of as liberal. So that relates to Oedipus. Teleology relates to Oedipus because obviously everything that happens is inevitable. No matter how much they try to put it off, everything will lead to his fate. Certain tenets of morality are immutable. So it doesn't matter that he killed his father when he didn't know it was his father, or that he married his mother when he didn't know that it was his mother, because it's still wrong, so deeply wrong that he has to punish himself, which also goes with the absence of laws, with the idea of punishing yourself. Revenge killings are seen as moral and allowed. When he kills the Sphinx, he gets made the king, and when he kills his father, he doesn't think it's morally wrong until he knows that it's his father, so he thinks it's justified. And the narrative is also surrounded and structured in a series of debates when you go into the Parados with the Choragus talking, and Jocasta and everyone arguing. The philosophy of the Renaissance can be characterized by a movement away from Christianity and towards humanism. Humanism focuses on humans' abilities to act and not follow a religious plan blindly. So you can contrast this with theology in Oedipus and in the time of Aristotle. And it can also incorporate religion, which Petrarch developed the idea of that, or it cannot incorporate religion. So we see in Hamlet, there are certain tenets of religion, like when Hamlet doesn't kill his father because he thinks his father will go to heaven. He's very wrapped up in the idea of sinning and not sinning. He's still religious, but it still also incorporates humanism, and we'll get into how it does. And then other values of the Renaissance are individualism and skepticism. So Hamlet has a choice to make, and he doesn't have any guidance other than the ghost, which himself is a kind of corrupted religious figure. He can either be seen as sort of a godly presence, that he's here from the afterlife, he's Hamlet's father, obviously the Holy Ghost, the father, and he can be seen as kind of guiding Hamlet towards this inevitable conclusion, or he can be seen as a corrupting influence and just a bad human. And you see evidence that Hamlet's father was a bad human when he was still alive. So Hamlet has to make his choice, and he doesn't really have any guidance or anything that he knows is going to happen, except for a corrupted religious figure, which incorporates humanism, moving away from Christianity. And just to add to the idea that the ghost is a corrupted religious figure, The guards and Horatio and Hamlet all express skepticism about the influence of the ghost, and he's morally ambiguous. It's a coming of age story where Hamlet has to suddenly make a lot of decisions that he never thought he'd have to make, and where his father dies. Now he has a lot more responsibility than he had, and he has to grapple with this, and that can be compared to the kind of Renaissance, which is a huge movement where so much stuff is changing and happening. You're seeing a conflict between Christianity and humanism, so having to suddenly make a lot of decisions in a very drastic, sudden way can be seen as a shift away from Christianity and towards humanism in Hamlet himself. So modernism, I have Ezra Pound's Make It New slogan here, because that's really the tenet of modernism. It's at its core a rejection of the former ideas and societies and what we formerly believed. So the modernists believe that you need to re-examine every aspect of the world, which includes commerce, philosophy, art, aesthetics, politics, the economy, everything, to find out what's holding us back and why they're wrong. So they believe in freedom of expression, experimentalism, radicalism, and, ironically, primitivism. Your base instincts. They also try to startle and alienate audiences, so often very stark, surprising images can be seen in modernist works. And they either believe in revolutionizing or rejecting politics, and that just depends on the person. If they think that we are in a time of revolution and that they need to change things very drastically, or if they think that we just need to say it's wrong, but not change, That depends on the person. So Death of a Salesman, you see the rejection of the American dream, which is a very traditional idea in the American psyche. You also see common ideas and sayings juxtaposed with sad, arresting images. So if at first you don't succeed is a very common, very colloquial way of basically just saying the American dream. But you see it contrasted very sharply with the image of a sad man who's like begging Bernard, for this, just a sad man in an office in his business suit. It's very stark, and you see a contrast between traditional ideas and the places they lead. You also have traditional views of the business world represented by Willy Loman, because he believes in a very traditional sense of the business world used to be very good and now it's not. And you say that they're false, which is represented by his dying and his delusions and the fact that he no longer feels that he can live in the business world, or he can be successful.
So on to the topic of characterization. This is where I'll kind of go over the characters. So for Oedipus, you see the stereotypical tragic hero. He's dynamic slightly dynamic. He's mostly static because he doesn't really have a change and doesn't really realize the error of his ways. Jocasta is an example of why not to resist fate, pretty flat. Creon is also pretty flat. Tiresias, which is the blind seer, is pretty static. He more is just an input character to serve as the gods and that kind of message. Ismay and Antigone are flat as well. They're more there to serve as an idea that he still had a family, and they're just more there as placeholders, kind of like a Cinderella, so they're flat. The messengers, which have little status and little description, are also flat. Circling back to Hamlet, Hamlet is also a tragic hero. He's pretty dynamic, especially compared to Oedipus. I feel like he actually has internal reflection, and there's a lot of balance back and forth between his mental state. Claudius, his uncle, which is the foil of Hamlet, is also pretty dynamic, at least what you consider his former self to be. But for the rest of the play, I feel like he's pretty static. Gertrude, mother to Hamlet and wife to Claudius, I feel like she's pretty dynamic because she turns from not caring to at the end of the play sacrifices herself for her son. Polynesius, Lord of Chamberlain to Claudius, is static. He's pretty conniving the whole entire time. And Horatio, the best friend of Hamlet, seems to be pretty static. Ophelia, I would have to say she is somewhat dynamic, but others could argue that she's flat. She's pretty much just as a love interest, so that's could why people argue she's flat. Laertes is pretty static as well because he's pretty loyal and honorable. He serves as that type of character. Fortinbras is pretty static. He only comes in at the end. The Ghost is also pretty flat because he really serves like only the purpose of getting across the message that there was a murder. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are more pawns of the court, so that would make understand why they would be considered flat. Now this is where it gets a little interesting, at least in my opinion. All these characters listed are pretty much characters there to forward the plot, and they're all flat. It kind of shows how, and they're all lower class as well. It kind of shows how they're just there to be there. For Death of a Salesman, Willie kind of throws up a little bit of a front in the beginning, and then he transfers and kind of de-evolves into an insecure person, then goes all the way to the point of killing himself. I would say that's pretty dynamic and very tragic hero-like. Biff in the beginning has more of a like looks up to his father, and then at the end he tends to like shift his views on him and kind of sees him for the failure and tragic hero that he actually really is. So I'd say that's pretty dynamic. Linda is pretty loyal and subservient to Willie throughout the whole entire play. She has character traits, but they don't really change. Happy is confident and is a foil to Biff, at least the earlier version of Biff, and so I'd say he's pretty static. And Charlie is pretty flat as well, even though I would have to say he does put input onto Willie's life. I would still have to say he really doesn't have a character evolution. Bernard, the son of Charlie, is kind of a foil to Biff as well. He is successful, unlike Biff is. He's pretty static. The rest of the characters are either static or flat. I feel like the only characters they really focus on in a play are the main characters, and the rest of them, they don't really go and dive into their headspace. Yes, I would have to say that, but Willie's boss, though, is an interesting character to look onto. In Death of a Salesman, as continuing on with that, Miss Forsky and Letta are call girls. They're pretty flat, and Jenny is also flat. To compare all of them, male dominance. Seems to be a reoccurring theme. There's few in where there are females, they're pretty weak. Only certain characters have their internal thoughts shown, which tend to be main characters, so there's still confusion on what people are actually thinking. And as the time periods change, so do the insight on the mind. I feel like there's less stereotypes in Death of a Salesman compared to Oedipus, and that just shows that the evolution of the script writers and how the times have changed. That goes along with the previous section on sociology that Grace has covered. You could take a lot into this. Social status as well. That is something I've kind of been hinting at. In Oedipus, every minor character that is flat is lower class. And in Hamlet, the majority of the characters who are low class are static. There's very few and far between. And Death of a Salesman, if they fit a stereotype of that social class, then they tend to be flat, which is kind of a concept that is also a social criticism. So I thought that was very interesting and way more in depth than that when you would see in a play, for example, like Oedipus.
All of them involved family, and I noticed that Oedipus and Hamlet tended to have similarities, and then Hamlet and Death of a Salesman tended to have similarities, but not really Oedipus and Death of a Salesman. Like, they had some. They were kind of split like that. Like, Oedipus and Hamlet shared religious themes in them, and they used religion as like a guiding point, versus Death of a Salesman, he was mainly focused on the American dream and his own like life. He wasn't really looking towards God. In Oedipus and Hamlet, they both involved their family and needing to like defend it. Like in Oedipus, he left his home, well, at least who thought he was his family, because he didn't want the prophecy to come true. And in Hamlet, he was more so looking towards revenge against his family because his uncle killed his dad. In Death of a Salesman, there's themes of family, but it was more so Willie wanting to ensure that his family was like successful and that they could strive and meet the American dream at the time. Overall, it seemed to me like Hamlet was a middle ground between the two stories, and it seemed to be the most similar to both of them. So, in all the stories, The idea of family is somewhat central. In Oedipus, he leaves home to prevent himself from killing his dad, but in trying to go against the gods and like his religion, he does. And then in Hamlet, it's like him wanting to avenge his father, who his uncle killed. And then both of them had family members that harmed each other, so that was kind of similar. In Death of a Salesman, there was also kind of harm between the family members, but it was more psychological than physical, because it was really like making these wild tales about how like his family was like successful and how like his life's awesome, but really like that kind of messed up his kids because they thought that they were doing pretty good, but they really weren't, and so they kind of had to come to that realization themselves. Was a similar thing in the two older stories. He mainly goes against God, and he thinks that he's better than them, whereas Hamlet actually follows like what he was taught in terms of religion. Like, he decides not to commit suicide in his severe not severe speech because he would spend the rest of his life in hell, versus Oedipus is just 100% okay with just going against the prophecy because he thinks that he'll be fine because he's better than the gods, so their prophecy shouldn't be able to hurt him. So for the differences, the time period does play into why some of the themes differ. The two older pieces, Oedipus and Hamlet, contain more religion than Death of a Salesman does, and Death of a Salesman focuses on the American dreams and advancements in society and like the character falling behind. Obviously, Hamlet and Oedipus, they wouldn't have even known about the American dream, and even then they were of a different social class than Willie and his family, so they wouldn't have to worry about their material needs. Oedipus and Hamlet both just were more concerned about their family and revenge and like setting up like their like legacies, versus Willie just was trying to make sure that his family could pay for everything that they needed, and he wasn't as concerned about morals. Like, he thought that he had a good like reputation, but really that was just like his insanity kind of peeking through.
On to format and structure. Oedipus is written in free verse. It uses debates a lot in the strophe and anastrophe, which is reminiscent of how philosophy was written at the time, so how Aristotle and Plato wrote. All of the action takes place off stage, so Oedipus stabbing out his eyes takes place off stage, and a lot of the historical stuff takes place off stage because the audience just assume that they're familiar with some background. But if you aren't familiar with them, you learn them along with Oedipus. So it's assumed you know that he killed his father and he married his mother. But if you don't know that, you'll just be learning it at the same time he does. Hamlet is written in early modern English. There's a mix of verse and prose. So that basically just depends on who's noble. So for an example of that, you can look at the scene with the gravediggers, the Alas Poor Yorick scene. The gravediggers are speaking in prose versus Hamlet in verse, except for when the gravediggers are singing. It's set in the courts of Denmark, which opens up to a lot of commentary on class. It's deeply involved in the life of a courtier or a king. Hamlet's performance of madness often leads to dialogue in which one character is confused or disturbed, like, for example, Polonius being disturbed during the scene where Hamlet sees him, the words scene. But Hamlet knows that he's just pretending to be angry, so one character is often confused while the other is not. In Death of a Salesman, it's written in modern English and prose. The set is also built in the way where when Willie is dreaming or having his delusions, the walls disappear. So instead of walls in the room, it's just borders that the actors can walk through, which represents as breaks from reality. Many people disagree with him when he is being delusional, and that's where you kind of see the debates and the dialogue happening again, and background information is conveyed through flashback. So when we look at the similarities and differences, the similarities are the commentary on nobility and class in the dialogue of every play. So with Hamlet, you see not only that there's verse and prose being used to differentiate class, but then you see Hamlet's madness when he's saying things that are vulgar and surprising. That's contrasting with what you'd think of as a noble way to carry yourself. Willie's delusions can also contribute to nobility and class commentary, because you're seeing very much a very disturbed man, and his delusions are all about class, especially in his delusions of importance. And then Oedipus's refusal to listen to others and the chorus turning on him also are commentary on nobility and class. So when you see all of the choragus, like all the people turning on him as a king, it's about him being a bad king. So in that way, commentary on nobility and class is in the dialogue a lot. And then characters also debate their worldviews in all these. So in Oedipus, you see the strophe and the anastrophe debating. You also see Jocasta a lot involved in arguments. With Hamlet, you see him debating with himself and others about how he should treat the Claudius situation. And in Death of a Salesman, you see Willie arguing with his sons and with the people around him. You also see him arguing with Charlie about his views on parenting and money. And then the differences is that they all fit their particular eras of theater. So Oedipus fits Greek theater in that all of the action and gore is shown off stage. And so it's structured kind of avoiding those scenes. You see Hamlet in like the reflection of its era in Hamlet, because it's structured very much around the politics of the time of Denmark, and very involved in the courts of Denmark. And then in Death of a Salesman, you see it very much fitting into modernism, that art movement, the way that it's non-linearly structured, the way that it's non-linearly structured is very much to do with modernism.